So if you guys could change one thing about the world, what would it be? I realize that might be a weird question because God created the world, but
It's broad.
that's a broad question.
There's so many ways I can go. Anthony, you can start.
There's so many ways that you could go, but you want me to start.
Yeah. I want to see how far we're going with this.
I mean, I could just Jesus juke it all and say get rid of original sin and then solve all of our problems in one hit. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There we go.
Change anything about the world, just like what is factual. So like food equals calories. Is anything off the table?
Yeah, no, like let's go that direction.
Yeah, because that's like,
Because there's a lot of like problems, like you said, like let's fix some problems if we're changing one thing about the world. But let's go more that direction. With
I would make it to where all food does not equal a caloric count.
So be able to eat whatever you want,
Yep.
whatever you like, without the
100%.
consequences of it. Sweet. What about you, Anthony?
Mine would be some form of like teleportation in that we would not be geographically bound. So like if you could legitimately just go to like, hey, I'm trying to go see the Eiffel Tower tonight. Like you could just be able to do that. I think that would be pretty sweet.
Never mind, I'm taking Anthony's. That's cool.
That's 100% cool. I like both of these. I would say for me, I think I would like to not lose my train of thought is what I would like. No, I would like to be able to hold and retain all of the things that I learn. Like
Yeah,
I feel
that's
like
a
I
good
spend
one.
so much time
That's a good one.
like reading, so much time like trying to think through ideas and stuff, but then I feel like how much of that have I lost?
That's true.
So
That's
or just
good.
not retained. So I think that's something I would change.
Like almost, or maybe like scan a book with your eyes. Like
Nah, I still want to do the work. I want to learn. I want
You
to
could
learn.
change anything, and you still want.
I don't know. I think I
Yeah.
would take Mackey's if I could just like absorb information
no.
instantaneously.
And it's.
I don't want to matrix upload it. I mean, half the joy for me is being able to like work through it. You know what I mean? Like I
very
like that
studious of you.
I
process.
would just say that's very intellectual of you.
It
Chris.
is, yeah.
Yeah, it's not that. I mean, that's with everything. Like I like the work.
Some of us peasants would just rather take the shortcut.
He's like, I actually want to work harder for my information. Chris is like, I wish I read half the speed I do now.
You went with the Matrix. I was thinking of Baymax on Big Hero 6,
Oh,
where
and
he
he just
just like
downloads?
uploads his programming, whatever he wants
yeah,
him to know. I'm like, dude, that'd be sweet if I could
That
do
would
that.
be sweet.
Yeah.
Well, hey, welcome to the Branch Podcast. I am here today joined by Pastor Anthony and by Pastor Mackey, and we're having a good time so far. So thank you guys so much for joining us. We are going to be talking about a topic today that is, it might seem a little headier at first, but I think it has a lot of practical implications for our life and our faith. And so what I want to talk about is this idea that we as Western Americans live in an individualistic culture. Now, what we know about like the church and what we know about ancient times is that was not the culture that our faith really took shape in. And so community was a big part of the early church. And what I want to explore today is why was that such a big part of it? Why is it a part of so many cultures around the world still today? The idea of community and how does that like interact with, or how do we learn and grow from these different pictures that we have of community, and then just how it makes an implication in our life, and how we apply, how do we live a life of community while still knowing that we live in an individualistic society. So like the tension that creates, and why I think it's difficult for us to truly be communal people in the world in which we live right now. So I want to start just simply by defining what does it mean when we say individualistic and when we say communal or community. What are the definitions of those two things, and why are they important? Why is the discussion important for us to have?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is, as you noted, as a culture, we are almost entirely individualistic in our thinking, right? That's the way that our society functions. It's the way most people function. It's almost one of those things that, as we've said before, it's kind of like you're swimming in the water and you don't even realize it, right? It's just the way that we think. So I think that has to just be acknowledged.
Can you give an example when we say that it's just the way that we operate, the way that we think? Can you give some examples of what you mean?
Well, I think every day, most of us get up and we're thinking about our own opinions, our own preferences, what we're going to do, what we want to eat for lunch. Like, we're not naturally thinking how our lives and our behaviors and our relationships are interdependent on other people.
Sure.
Right. And so there's a little bit of a disconnection here. I mean, even and studies will actually prove this now, especially with the heyday of social media. There's more ways to be connected online than ever, and yet people are feeling more alone than they ever have.
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of disembodied existence where we are going about our days, we're going about our normal routines, we're living in our homes, driving in our cars, going to our jobs. And again, we don't oftentimes think about the bigger picture of how we fit into relationships with other people and how interdependent we really are. And so I think, yeah, all of us as individuals, we're going to have preferences. We're going to have opinions. That's never going to be erased, no matter what culture you go to around the world. There's some degree where we can never get away from being an individual, right? There's
Sure.
a uniqueness to each of us. And I would actually say that's God ordained. God created us to be each unique in our individual expressions, the gifts that he's given to us, all the way to our physical traits, right? Our unique physical traits, the way that we look, all of that in some degree is individual and it's a unique expression. But I think we also lose who we are in relationship to the whole. So who we are in relationship to our families, who we are in relationship to the church. What does it mean to be the people of God rather than thinking of ourselves as simply single individuals and kind of being disconnected from the rest of the whole?
Yeah. It's an important discussion too, because like you said, it's the water we're swimming in. We don't realize it. Is you've put it well as well. Like our culture is one of individualism. Everything promotes individualism. You consume content in an individual way. The things that gratify us in a capitalistic society even are very individualistic. Like the things that we spend money on, all these things, right? We're swimming in that stream. We're a part of that culture. And the reason this is so important for us is as Christians, this is a very subversive idea to what we're living in. It's like Christianity is a communal faith. It's a faith that's supposed to be lived with others, with people. And instead, in a culture that does not promote that, we're very much kicking against the goads and going against the grain of what culture is telling us to do.
So when we talk about community, we've kind of defined what individualism is. Mackie, share a little bit give some examples of what it means to live in community and to be communally minded, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So a great example at our church is connect groups, right? So we can point to that one as an obvious one where we promote this being such a high octane, very important part of your discipleship, your Christian discipleship, living in community with one another. And that means being generous with each other, learning with each other, learning about Christ with each other, right? You think of just from a broader context, the fruit of the Spirit, many of those fruit, right, that you list, love, joy, peace, those are things that you can do for yourself as an individual, but a lot of them are best observed in relationship with others. Like kindness, you can be kind or unkind to yourself, but when is kindness most observed? It's when you're being kind to someone or not being kind to someone. So all these things point to a Christian faith that's lived together, that's lived in community. And connect groups is a great part of this. Anytime that you're generous with each other in the Christian brotherhood and sisterhood, that is community. That's our faith being lived out. So in so many ways, it's almost the DNA of what we do as a Christian follower.
Yeah. And the tension and why I wanted to talk about this was this Sunday I was getting ready to teach, and I would say not so much Sunday was I thinking about this, but more so as I prepared the message, I was thinking the truth that I taught, how does this apply to both us as individuals, but also us as a community? So I taught a little bit about spiritual warfare and like our role in it, and it was about the shield of faith and how that kind of how it protects us, but really the tension point for me was, I know we think individualistically, so I wanted to approach the message from, we have to put on the shield of faith because it protects us, it protects me, you know what I mean, and it protects my faith. But also, that's not the only thing. We are also part of a mission. We're part of a broader perspective of what God is doing in the world, and God has called us into community to play a part of what he's doing in the world. And so I wanted us also to think about, what does it mean if that God protects us for the mission that he's trying to accomplish? And so this tension of like, I know typically we're all thinking about that self, but we also need to be thinking about each other and how it affects the community and the bigger picture, like you guys had mentioned. So why is the individualistic, let me back up a little bit more before I ask that question. Talk a little bit about the biblical idea of relationship and why God designed us for a relationship, or the importance that God designed us for a relationship, and why forsaking community at the greatest degree is so dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think starting out, so we could go two routes, and maybe we'll go both. Like there's pre-fall and post-fall. So so God's original intent, and then what happened after sin entered the world. Obviously, God himself is triune. So the fact that God exists in eternal relationship in his very essence and being, I think is crucial, because God has made us in his image. And so what that means in practical terms is that means we were created for relationship with God, our creator, but also created for relationships with one another. And I know we've talked about this before, but it's one of the most unique things about the Genesis accounts. The first thing that's mentioned that's not good, and many things are mentioned good. Everything God creates is good, and then God looks at his creation and said it's very good. The first time we hear that something is not good is that Adam is alone. And that's interesting. It's interesting because he wasn't alone in the sense that God was there with him. He had God, but he was unique in that all the other animals had other pairs, a pair to go with them. So they weren't isolated as unique in and of themselves. And so God creates Eve, and there's this beautiful picture of now Adam is experiencing relationship in the way that God intended for all of human flourishing. And the beautiful picture, I know we're getting really into marriage here and even sexuality, like a part of this is the fact that God commands them to be fruitful and multiply. And so out of this small community comes all of humanity, the greater community of human beings that exist out of this life-giving relationship that we call marriage. And so in the beginning, God created, I would say, relationships not only as a reflection of who he is and his nature and is the way that we're called to interact with each other, but it's also a gift. It's a blessing. It's a joy. And I would say that all of us here, the high points of our lives have to do with our relationships with other people, the people that mean the most to us, our spouses, our friends, our children, our parents, whoever that might be. So relationships are central. I would say this takes on a different form post-fall. When sin enters the world, obviously relationships get very difficult. And it's difficult because we assert the individual self. And so if you think about the concept of relational breakdown, it's usually because of something that someone did out of their own selfishness. They're self-seeking. They do something that harms the other person and thereby destroys the relationship. And so one of the things that God intended, I would say, in the greater community in the church would be that not only we would be a source of encouragement and help and love to one another, but the other component of that would be that it would be a source of our sanctification, that is our transformation. So God wants to repaint that picture of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where we reflect him again. And one of the ways that he does that is in relationships with other people. And so we learn, even as Mackie was saying, like the fruits of the Spirit, we learn what it means to love. We learn what it means to be patient. In what context? In the context of relationships with other people, which is why even in 1 John, the Apostle John talks about this relationship about like you can't love God whom you haven't seen if you are not loving your brother who you do see, right? This idea of like there is this interplay between learning what it means to love, and that has to do with our human relationships, and that's the way God intended it to be.
That's really powerful, I think, because I know in my life I've had moments where I've been like, if I could just get this stuff in order, then me and God could be good. But then I get to the place where I get into relationships and I'm constantly confronted with all these ways in which I fail to live up to God's standards. And relationship exposes that. You know what I mean? It exposes it, and it creates this moment where I realize like I might be able to clean up. As an individual believer, I might be able to clean up my life to a certain degree, but the things that really need to change in my life are always exposed and find their greatest fulfillment within relationship with others.
100%.
And so like I think that's such an important thing, that we aren't just individual believers. We aren't just individuals as people, but we live and exist and grow out of relationship. Mackie, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, buddy.
Oh, you didn't at all. Yeah, no, 100% of both of what you guys said. You learn this too. You're both married. As soon as you get married, you learn this really early, right? Is that you are not your own self, and that's not the purpose of your living either. Like we speak about and think about this concept of dying to self, right? That's also exposed in relationship. Dying to self means nothing outside the context of relationship. It really doesn't, right? It's like there's nowhere to go from there. It's like, all right, I'm dying to self for what? It's to serve the other, right? It's to be, and then you see throughout the New Testament, like even to fast forward on what the timeline, Anthony, you've given, you see throughout the book of Acts that faith is lived out in community, that these churches are meeting in homes, right? At that time, it's not the context we have, where we are building buildings to better do community, to better do ministry. But in that time, they're meeting in homes, living in community with one another. And a lot of the sin that we see that's exposed, right, is in relationship. You know, I think of this story of Ananias and Sapphira, right? Like you think of that story, it's a crazy story.
It is crazy.
They've lied to God. They've lied to the church, right? Yeah. And that's the premier sin of why it's such a crazy story. I would venture, and I know we're pushing the text to its limits, I'd venture one of the sins within that too is that they were lying in relationship and lying to the church that they were a part of, right? Yeah. Is that they were actually a part of a mission that you mentioned earlier, and they were part of this, and they had made a commitment to something, and then they lied about it and committed this sin. And over again, like you said, sin is exposed in relationship. And our faith is just so much, you know, it has to be lived in relationship.
When you started off talking about marriage, I thought you were going to go where I've shared, what I've shared with a lot of people is, man, I thought that I was like so spiritually mature until I got married. And then as you said, Chris, like it was exposed. My selfishness was exposed. And so again, that goes back to where like God's purpose, I would say one of God's major purposes for marriage and in relationship to other people in general is not only that it would be a source of blessing and joy to us, because one of the fundamental things we have to acknowledge, and I alluded to this by talking about Genesis and how God created us, is belonging is a fundamental need. That we were not created to do life alone. And so we all need belonging. We need community. We need people that know who we are and acknowledge us. I would go so far as to say most of what we do in life is us attempting to make ourselves look valuable and lovable. So like you think about whether it be the car that we drive, the clothes that we wear, our image on social media, so much of what we do is wanting to portray ourselves in a way that we are desirable. Well, you think about that. What is that actually saying? It's saying my biggest fundamental need is belonging. It's relationship. Now, as Christians, we would say the foundation of that has to be with God, right? Because he's the one that created us. And so when we know who we are and we know we have a place of belonging, that we're loved, then it allows us, it frees us, right? It gives us the capacity then to be able to start loving to where our relationships are no longer about taking. And so when our relationships are all about taking, getting what I want, we're still not thinking properly because we're thinking in an individualistic sense in which I'm looking for gratification from this relationship. So I've done a lot of like premarital counseling with people, and I just say it's not like this is like a major revelation, but I say the single greatest way to destroy your marriage is just be selfish. When you make your marriage about yourself and getting everything that you want at the expense of the other person, you will very quickly erode your marriage. You'll very quickly destroy your marriage. Yeah. And so even in that, I think the unique thing in Christianity is when God becomes the foundational relationship of our lives, he fills up our cup so that we're able to love, we're able to be patient, we're able to then give something away. And then a part of that process is you're helping transform other people who are experiencing that. And it continues to have this ripple effect. But when God is not the foundation, what happens is we try to get what we cannot fully receive from other people and thereby crush the person and destroy the relationships. And so relationships are best going to be experienced in the way that God intended them to be when he is the foundation of that and the way that we operate.
Well, I love that. I love the idea of thinking through like how Paul describes relationship, both in Ephesians chapter 5. Like he gives a great picture of the mindset that we have in. He uses the example of marriages in chapter 5, but he takes that even to the entire church in Corinthians, where it's you think about others before you think about yourself. And it's not that you're not important and that you don't have value or that you don't have needs that need taken care of. But the idea is like if I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and we both feel, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, and
absolutely.
we're both taken care of.
Yeah.
And so like this is Paul's mindset. If we can shift our focus to focusing on the community at large or the other person, if it's talking about personal relationships, like then we are embodying the way that Christ loved us, the way that Christ gave to us. And then the relationship, the community flourishes.
Yeah.
And that's a shared foundation that you would have with the people you're in relationship with. What you were saying, Anthony, brings up like an idea of like, have you ever tried to live in community with people that like don't share the same values as you? It's hard, borderline impossible.
Yeah, 100%.
Borderline impossible, because you are trying to cultivate thriving relationships with people that are not starting off in the same fundamental place as you.
Yeah.
And we see this happen a lot. We see even in different community aspects and different ideals, different areas and spaces where they try to build community, but because that community isn't based on the same shared value system, the same standard of truth, like in our postmodern context, like no one shares the same value of truth at this point, right? No one says, hey, what's truth is, and then this person also says that's also truth. It rarely happens.
Yeah.
So when you try to build that community off of something that's a shaky foundation like that, where you don't share the same values and belief system, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, and you see that, I would say you see that with a lot of Christians, and I don't want to get too far off topic here, but I almost feel like it needs to be said in relationship to what you just mentioned. One of the ways I've seen this a lot is Christian young adults who end up selling out their faith. I know that's strong language, but selling out their faith to be in a romantic relationship with someone who's not following Christ. And the amount of stress that it ends up putting on the relationship, because right, the idea of division is two visions, right? You're going in different direction. You're not building your life and foundation on the same thing. And so I would just say, like, as a warning to people, to make sure you don't make that mistake, right? Don't like wait on God, trust in God. Don't like, that's where I would say a lot of times loneliness, this is where the church is supposed to come into play, because marriage isn't for everyone. There are going to be people who live in singleness. They're okay with that.
Yeah.
The Bible is very clear on that, 1 Corinthians 7. And so the idea would be, to your point, Mackie, whether it be in marriage, the foundation is on Christ, right? This loving union. But if marriage is not going to be a part of your life, it would be that the Christian community would be that source of love and belonging, where you experience true friendship, true relationship. Because again, whether you're married or not, belonging is a need. Belonging is something we all fundamentally long for. And so the Christian community then becomes the foundation. So Christ is still the foundation of that relationship, where again, it governs the way that we treat one another. The idea of forgiving, being forgiven, the idea of humility, service oriented, all of these things that then should govern the way that we relate. And then, I mean, this is God's whole point. Like, the church is supposed to be a microcosm of what the world longs for. So the church is to be a picture of the relationships that God intended us to have. But I think it is important, like you pointed out, Mackie, that is the foundation, and that is really the source of everything else flows from Christ, and the relationships that God intended us to have can only be experienced in its fullness when we live that way.
So how do we make that shift? What are the targets that we're looking for as a community to begin to make the move towards, or how should we approach when we're coming to community? Say we're starting a new church, or I don't mean like you're starting a church, but I mean you start to attend a new church. You know what I mean? Or we're joining, we move to a different city. What are the things that what are the goals of community, and how do we shift our mindset to begin to live that out and to embrace those values?
As I was thinking through this topic, I said this to a friend years ago at this point, and I think it's pretty practical for anyone that's maybe they feel like they're in that individualistic stream of their faith, or just that they do feel shut off or cut off, or they're hearing this right now and they're like, you know what, I do need to live in community. I need to be healthier about that. I need to be more honest or faithful about that. I told this to a friend. I said, when is the last time you made a decision based on how it'll impact your community? So if you do have a community, is every decision you're making, maybe not every, but a lot of the decisions you make, do you take into account how will this impact the community that I'm in? Because you see this in the biblical narrative, that happens a lot, that those decisions do impact. We know, like you alluded to, sin is that decision. When you decide to commit a sin, it's exposed in community. So how often are we making decisions based on how it'll impact the community that we're in?
Yeah, and I don't think most of us think that way. No. Right? Because again, we've been so conditioned by culture. I mean, you think of like the entire billion billions of dollars in the marketing industry is being based upon the fact that not only are we consumers, but we're individual consumers, right? And so even the concept of like a target audience, I'm going after specific individuals who, I can solve their problem with this specific product that I'm selling. And so you kind of work backwards from that, and everything really then revolves around us. What's going to make my life better? What's going to make my life easier? What's going to make my life more convenient? The problem with that is all of that is fundamentally opposed to living in community, because to live in community means I'm going to be bothered by other people. To live in community means I no longer think only about myself, but I think about my neighbor. I think about my brother or sister. Sure. So the entire orientation of the way that we think is shifting. And so unless we're being taught that, unless we're taking baby steps to begin doing that, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. That's not our natural, because sin has affected all of us, our natural way of thinking is individualistically, because we're selfish creatures. Like that's the truth. That's the hard truth, but it is the truth. So we're thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about what's best for us. When I would say the entire New Testament, Jesus and Paul, all the apostles would say, think about also what's best for your brother or your sister. Think about what's best for your neighbor. Even the classic story that Jesus gives of the Good Samaritan, right, illustrates this point of like, whose neighbor are you going to be, right? The question is not, who is my neighbor, but it's whose neighbor are you going to be? The initiative is for you to take, right? The ball is in your court. That's good. And even think about that at a practical level. I'm willing to bet most people, even at this church and in most churches in America, how many of them like actually know their physical neighbors, like the people living to the right of them and the left of them? Like, do they interact with their neighbors at all? Is there any sense of community there where like, hey, you see your neighbor doing something and you jump in to help and you ask how you can serve them, or, hey, can I give you a hand with this project? We're so engrossed in our own individual lives. And I know we even talked briefly, like our own nuclear families, which isn't entirely bad. Right. Like God has a place for that. And there's so much good that can come from that. But I think when we're thinking only in terms of ourselves, we miss out not only on the beauty and blessing of community, but as you said earlier, we miss out on part of God's mission for us as his people to bring impact to the world around us and the people around us by extending community to them, by being the good neighbor.
Yeah. And that's not exclusive to the secular world either, about not knowing our physical neighbor, whatever. Like it's in our ecclesiology. You think through the 20th century, like in the West and America specifically, churches met multiple times a week. And why? It was for community, right? It wasn't even the intake and experience. It wasn't highly experiential at first, right? Yeah. It was for the idea of community. A friend of mine have talked about this multiple times, how even when I was a kid, you went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, every single week.
At least 3 times a week.
And that was your community, right? And we've done things, the Capital C Church and even us have done things to circumvent that issue, where we now have small groups where before that wasn't a huge idea that was, perpetuated and whatever it may be. But still, we see this in the church, that slowly but surely we've spent less and less time together. And that our expectations as Christians, as followers of Jesus, the expectation has been to spend less and less time together, to have more and more nights to myself, have more and more nights to be secluded and reclusive. And it's very fascinating because it's impacted the church just as much as the world.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing, and I know we're probably going to maybe go in a different direction, but I think one of the illusions that we have to become aware of is that the more that you focus on self, the more happy you're going to be. And I would say that is one of the great deceptions of the enemy, who tells us this lie of like, the more that you focus on self, the more that you get things your way, the more convenient things are, the more that you cater to yourself, that's where happiness is found. And that's a fundamental lie. It's actually, no, it's the giving of yourself to other people. It's the giving of yourself to God that you experience that fundamental human longing that has been, so many things have been piled up on it, we don't even recognize it. Sure. Yeah. So I think even acknowledging that, to realize, oh man, I get it. Like there's times where I don't want to go over to somebody's house for dinner. I don't want to have someone over for dinner because I just want to go home and sit and relax. Because it's costs something to emotionally be engaged, physically to be engaged with a person. And yet every single time I do it, I'm like, man, I'm so glad that we went over there. I'm so glad we had them over, because I'm reminded, oh, this is something I desperately need, even though my brain tells me something different sometimes, because I've been so conditioned to think that there's other outlets out there. There's other alternatives that are going to make me happier and make life more restful. And the truth is, most of the time, that's deceptive.
Well, isn't it that it's driven by fear? Like we think if we have the mindset that it takes to be communally driven people, to live communally, we won't have time for ourselves. Like as you guys were talking, I was thinking about like even my own mindset and how I operate in a lot of different times. Like I like quiet alone time.
Yeah.
So like the very first thing that feels threatened to think communally is that I might have to spend more time outside of myself than I like. I'm going to lose that. And so there's fear of that. I'm going to lose my independence. I'm going to have to sacrifice and do what God wants me to do instead of what I want to do. You know what I mean? And or do what's best for the community instead of what I want to do. And so I think that lies at the bottom of all of this is that we're afraid that if we take on the mindset of thinking of others first, of living communally, doing what's best for the community, that we're going to lose ourselves as individuals. Now, what I want to ask you guys is, can we do that? Can we over buy into the idea of community, what we would call probably codependency, to the hurt of what God created us for to be as individuals? Is it important to rest and rejuvenate? How do we find this healthy balance of, and I'll ask, let me back up from there. Is it a balance? And if so, how do we navigate that tension between we are individual selves, but we're also a part of something bigger than ourselves in community?
Sure. Well, what I mentioned earlier, like I do feel in the Christian context, the pendulum has swung so far. So I feel like at this point it would be hard to overcorrect, right? Like I do believe that at its core that like there are things that we should be doing. Now, codependency is an interesting topic, and even thinking through that, and I've heard people discuss that, codependency is really dangerous in the context of a singular relationship, right?
Sure.
If I only have one friend, if I only have one person to depend on, and so forth. But
maybe I use that term improperly. So
no, I don't think so. No, I think it's a good thing to think about, though. I think it's a good thing to bring up because that is one of the dangers of like, oh, I do live in community. Well, you only have one friend. You know what I mean? So like, I don't know if that's a common problem, right? But it's a problem to think through. So.
Well, and the other thing that I was thinking about the person that like hyper connects to a church, overcommits, and then you watch them just slowly like burn out. Like, you know what I'm saying? So if we're chasing community to hide or mask something that maybe chaos is going on in our lives somewhere else, or you know what I'm saying? Like, I think community can be it's like anything else. It can become a mask for avoiding what God's really doing in our lives. So like I was thinking in that direction, like, can there be a way that we overdo it with community?
Well, I think part of the answer is that, when we say community, we're not saying busyness. And I think actually, as I think about that even out loud, busyness is probably one of the great threats to community. And so, you were talking about the nuclear family and kids, sporting events and travel, baseball. And I mean, you come up with it, and people have all kinds of commitments. And so for them, the issue is, I think, when we're talking about community, what are we actually talking about? Are we just simply talking about being around people? Because I think that's where a lot of people would say, well, I'm around people all the time.
Yeah.
So I think even defining, what are we talking about when we talk about community? I think we alluded to it earlier. Are you with people that, in our case, are striving hard after following Jesus and trying to live in a way that reflects and honors him? Because you can be around your son's travel baseball team, their other players' parents, and you can be around them and not be filled up and not have anyone deeply know you or care about you and pray with you and encourage you through your difficult moments of life, to where you would ask yourself the question, if I was in a hard season of life, would I call any of these people? And maybe someone would say, yeah, there's a few people. So I think even defining what are we talking about when we talk about community, because we're not just talking about busyness, we're not just talking about being around people in general. We're talking about something, I think, a little bit deeper than that. The other thing I would say about like just losing ourselves and losing our individuality, I think there is a tightrope there, because to Mackie's point, we've overemphasized. We've swung the pendulum. So I mentioned to you earlier, even the language we use about like a personal relationship with Jesus. On one hand, I'm like, I understand that. On the other hand, I'm like, I want to get rid of that language because in some ways, I think it reinforces a negative thing. On one side, it's like, yes, all of us are going to stand before God and give an account of our lives individually.
Yeah.
All of us individually have to make a decision whether or not we're going to submit to Christ as Lord and follow him with the whole of our lives. So there's an individual component to that, which then brings in things like having a prayer life and having communion with God. So that's even another component I would say. Yeah, if you're hanging around with people all the time, is there that component where you do have moments of solitude and silence where you're alone with God, because you need that too.
Yeah.
Christ can be found in those quiet prayer moments, as well as Christ can be found in the community of his people.
Yeah.
And so we need to balance those and look at our lives and say, am I swinging the pendulum in one way or the other? And then the last thing I'll say to this topic too is I would say true community, I believe, assumes some level of individuality from each of its members. And what I would mean by that is God has ordained that the community of people be unique individuals. So like you think about Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 about the gifts, this entire idea, and you alluded to this earlier, the whole you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. There is a biblical sense in which that's true. We all have something to contribute through our experiences, through our stories, through our gifts. We all have something to offer to the community as a whole. And that's the beauty of the body of Christ. And so to lose our individuality would mean that the community in and of itself suffers. And so that's good news, because it means every one of us equally matters. Every single, I mean, read 1 Corinthians 12. Paul belabors this point. The members that sometimes we kind of dishonor, they get the highest honor. Like they matter, they're indispensable. And so there's a part of this where I think, no, it's not that we're saying, hey, it's being individual or being community. It's no, be an individual, unique person that God created and contribute to the whole. Think about what you bring to the table, not just what you get from other people, but what you can give, because in giving, you're also going to receive in the body of Christ, because that's how God intended it to be.
Yeah, they're not binaries, right? It's not one or the other. It's like be a better individual. Like even where the pendulum is swung with the personal relationship with God, I 100%. I grew up in the era where it's like relationship over religion. And I think we lost some things and sacrificed some things in that. And one of them being when we really are emphasizing like personal quiet times with God. Love that. I think that's awesome. But what is that for? Is that to make you a better Christian? What does that even mean? Is it to check something off a box? No, you should come out of those personal quiet times with God to be a better Christian unto each other.
Yeah, better member of the community.
To love better. Like, what's the whole point of not sinning or sinning less, right? Is to make you a better person in relationship. Like the less sin in your life and in your walk with Christ, the more love you can give each other. I heard a professor recently in a lecture he was doing, he said, you are not a Christian. And he's making a profound statement, and he was making a good point. You are not a Christian. We are Christians. Like when you are focusing on your personal Christian relationship, it's for the betterment, like you said, for the sake of the community. I'm sure you guys have heard C.S. Lewis's. He talks about his friends, and the friend that dies. And I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember quite the quote, but when the friend dies, a part of C.S. Lewis's kind of his personality went with him. Right? It's because that friend brought something out of him.
That's good.
Because him as an individual, right, brought something out of the relationship, out of the friendship, into the community. And now that it's just the two other friends, right, with him, something has changed, something has shifted. When we are better individuals, we should impact a community like that.
Yeah. Okay. The question that I have is practically, share a little bit how being a part of a community has impacted your faith. So as you guys have, knowing your stories, like I know you guys have been a part of different churches and like growing up and just through different jobs and whatnot. But how has the body of Christ, how has being part of the community, how has that changed you, shaped you, and really empowered you for grasping onto who Jesus is and what he's doing in our lives?
I think there's a power in confession. I know you guys talked about that, right? I think there's a power in confession with there's this term that got thrown around a lot in modern church called accountability partners, right? Where they would have accountability partner. But it has been a powerful thing for my faith is to have someone I can confess my sin to, is someone they can confess their sin to me. And we could talk through that and work through that, and then we can hold each other accountable, right? That has been a powerful thing for my faith. It's, right, I'm revealing things, right? And I'm bringing out into light, and this person is responding actively and giving me, feedback encouragement, but also rebuke at times, right?
Yeah.
And this is a powerful thing that if we are to be too reclusive in our faith, we lose that immediately. If you don't have that person to say, hey, these are the things, the sin done around me, to me, by me, to that person, and they can give you that feedback. They can give you God's truth, right? It can't just be a person, I'm venting to this person, right? And there's a lot of dangers in all those things. But if you go to a person and say, hey, this person has your best interest in mind, but most importantly, a shared value, a shared foundation of Christ, then I think that's such a powerful thing for faith, and it has been for me.
Yeah, I think in a general sense, I think just being around a group of people that genuinely love Jesus and are going after it, like there's something about that's empowering. Like it's convicting in the most joyful of ways, where it's like, oh man, like I want to be all in too. It's this reminder that I'm not alone in this, and we're in this together, and we really are a part of something bigger than ourselves. So I would say in a general way, that's been a huge source of blessing and challenge to me. I would say the people that have so one of the things that oftentimes happens in the church, in the modern church, we miss out on the the intergenerational dimension of like we kind of silo different ministries and stuff. And so sometimes I think we miss out on gleaning from the wisdom of other people and other situations. And I would say this is true for both. Like I would say a lot of times older believers can be dismissive of younger believers and not listen to what they're experiencing and going through. And I would say the opposite is true. Like younger believers can be dismissive of older believers and think, well, they just don't understand and they don't know and they're out of touch. And so like one of the things that I've experienced from older believers is just gleaning great wisdom and insight from their life experiences, from their victories and from their failures. And having people in my life that have just been able to speak into situations and being able to, like, right along with sin and confession, like just to be able to talk to people that have your back and best interest in mind when you're struggling. And you're like, hey man, could you just pray for me? I'm in the thick of it right now. I'm going through a difficult time. And then I would also say the people that have affirmed my worth to the community has been such a gift to me, where even as I was saying earlier, my own unique gifts that I bring to the table, when people have been blessed by that and have spoken that to me, has just reminded me in those moments of doubt or insecurity where I think, man, I don't have anything to give. Like there's nothing that I'm doing that's unique. And when people have spoken those things to me, man, like what a gift that is. And that scratches another itch that I need, which is that I have a purpose. My life has meaning. And I think we all need that. And so I've experienced that, as well as experienced that from others, where their gifts and their unique wiring and their stories and experiences have been a blessing to me. And so, just that reciprocal nature of being able to give and receive so many times throughout my life has been such a great source of joy and encouragement to me.
Yeah, mine was going to be the exact same thing as what you guys shared. It is the fact of being able to come to a place where you're not nobody shows up to the church the lone hero, like, but your gifts and your skills, they matter. Like, and so like finding purpose and finding belonging with the things that you like, that you love, like, and the things that you love to do. Like I've been able to do things that I love to do within the context of the community. And I hope they've been a blessing to others. You know what I mean? But like, I feel like my calling and my purpose have been really wrapped up into this community. And so like, I love that. But then also the encouragement of like, I know people's stories as I look around the church and I come in on Sunday morning and I speak to people and I talk to people and I see how faith is played out in their life. And I look at the way in which they've struggled and yet still worshiped. I looked at the ways that they have been hurting and yet they've still encouraged. Like, and it's that we are surrounded by our motivation. We're surrounded by our the ability to get back up and go, to stay faithful to God. That doesn't happen in and of ourselves. That is because we are rooted in and grounded in all of these different people all around us that come together to this one place where we do have those shared values, where we proclaim Christ, and to see their faith play out in their everyday lives keeps my faith going, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's maybe just a little off topic, but it made me think of it when you guys were talking. I know one thing, Anthony, you mentioned is so powerful to me in my personal experience in faith. I remember going through the hardest times of my life and realizing, even saying in the moment, if I didn't have community right now, I'm not sure how I would have gotten through this, right? That I can depend on God as my refuge and my strength and my joy. But man, did community play such a huge part of those things,
Right.
that community was the biggest tool in the tool belt of God's providing refuge, right?
Yeah.
Providing safety and love and peace and all these things. And I'll say in the same vein, community and relationship, we've mentioned it multiple times, is where we're often hurt sometimes, or like sin happens, right?
Yeah.
So you can be hurt. And I remember Pastor Rich Villadas, he's in Brooklyn. I remember him saying this: you can be hurt and healed in the same community. And I think that's the most beautiful part of Christian community, right?
Yeah.
Is that like people are not perfect. People are like, please stop expecting people to be perfect. Like,
Yeah.
I hate when people are hurt and they're like, man, I'm hurt, man, I'm bitter, and all these things. Like, yes, that person that hurt you, that is real, that's true, and they did hurt you. You are hurt. That should all be validated. But there could be healing here. That's the art of relationship. That's the beauty of relationship. That it doesn't have to end and stay. That's the beauty of of Jesus, right? Is that it doesn't have to end at hurt and pain or a death of a relationship. That there can be healing.
Yeah, and what's funny about that is it's not unique to Christian community. I think that's the most ironic thing, is that people leave the church, and this isn't to dismiss. I mean, church hurt is a real thing. People have experienced some terrible things, and I want to be genuinely sympathetic to that.
Oh, 100%.
But the other side of it for me is like, you're never going to be in a relationship with someone where they don't hurt you or let you down in some capacity.
No.
And that's what Christianity teaches. In fact, not only in that we're all sinners, but the commands of the New Testament. I mean, I think of like Colossians 3, where Paul's like, if any of you have a complaint, be tenderhearted, forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven you. That is assuming people are going to hurt your feelings in the church. The commands make no sense outside of that paradigm. So like, I think we have to understand what you're just saying. And it really is a beautiful point. Like, there's going to be times where people hurt you. Like, that is the cost of relationship. I mean, that's really what's on the table there. You're going to be let down. You're going to be disappointed. You're going to be hurt by people. But the alternative is you become a hermit and you're isolated, which is, to me, a far worse option, because we were created to be in community.
Exactly.
And the unique thing about Christian community is, like you said, those are opportunities to experience the grace of God and healing and transformation in those moments, rather than, no, this doesn't just have to be the end. This doesn't have to be the death of the relationship. And I think that's really, really important for people to realize.
I was going to say, that's the power of the gospel. And that,
Yes.
particularly for Paul, through much of his writing, is that the testimony of the genuineness of the gospel in a community, the testimony of the power of the gospel, is the ability to overcome hurts and overcome those places where we just grate on each other, and to unite together again under the banner of Christ. And even thinking back, and this is kind of a jump back to what you said earlier, and I'm not trying to change the topic on it, but even thinking through what you said earlier, like with the individuality, the beauty of the gospel is that we're not homogenous. We're not one. One
not
type
all the
of
exact
person.
same.
We're not all the exact same. But the fact that God can unite and gather people that offend each other, hurt each other, and are completely different from each other, from all different walks of life, from different race, ethnicity, economic background, from different parts of the world, and you know what I mean, whatever category you want to throw on there, like we're all united under the banner of Jesus Christ, and that is powerful.
And you just used the word. So I remember I taught a sermon on Ephesians chapter 4, and really my main point was that, like, in Christ we are both unique and united. And it's this beautiful picture of there is this uniqueness, there's this diversity of the way that God has created us as people, and yet the amazing thing, the miraculous thing, if you will, is that we are united together, not because we have common hobbies, not because we have the same skin color, not because we have the same life experiences. We're united in Christ. And that is a testimony, as you said, of the power of the gospel to the world. And so, to the Christian that thinks, well, it's all about, as you joked earlier, and I see this all the time on social media, right? It's not about religion, it's about your personal relationship with Jesus. It misses out on everything we're talking about right now. It misses out on the simple fact that even the church is called the body of Christ, this embodiment of Christ's presence in the world as we live and move and interact with each other and forgive one another and pray for one another and serve one another. We are being the hands and feet of Christ. That's why we use that imagery, that language. And so to not be a part of that is to not participate in the life of Christ in a very practical way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and take 1 John seriously, like to love your neighbor or to love your brother and sister specifically within the church. Your fellow believer is, if you can't do that, you can't say you love God who's right unseen, he says.
Yeah.
But love your brother and sister. If you hate your brother and sister, there's no way you can
love of God is not in you.
It's like the love of God isn't in you, and it's love that unifies that, even through the division we've talked about, even through sin.
Yeah.
And to bring this conversation kind of full circle back to what you started with, Mackie, this is the subversive nature of community in our context and in our culture. The fact that we live this way, the gospel united, gospel love filled, you know what I mean? And we do that in spite of all the differences that we have. That is the testimony to our culture. And that is the way in which we live. I would say we live as Americans. If we live this way as church communities, that tells a story about the power of the gospel and about the truth of his goodness.
So good.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Well, guys, any last thoughts before we close up?
I don't think so.
So I think that sums it up.
I say we ran the spectrum on this one, man. I think we covered everything. So, well, not everything. That would make it sound like
Yeah, it'd be a lot longer.
we covered a lot. So
Yeah, absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate you listening, and we pray that it was beneficial, and we pray that also that this would help spur your thoughts and maybe in a different direction. If your faith has always been kind of central to you, we would encourage you and pray that you would begin to see how the church can be a benefit to your life, but also how you can be a benefit to the church and be a part of the broader community of Christ, and to find life and to find wholeness and to be a part of the mission of the church. And so if you need help with any of that, we would love to help get you connected and help you find ways that you fit and you belong. And that's not just in serving, but that's also in relationship and in all the different ways that this community is meant to flourish and thrive and help you flourish and thrive. So we love you guys. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.